Hi, Tom.
Hi, Greg.
How you doing? It's
I'm good, thanks.
good. It's good to be talking to you today. For viewers who may not be familiar with us, I'm Greg Marx. I am a staff writer at the Columbia Journalism Review, and I edit our United States project in which we attempt to critique, support, and monitor what you might call accountability journalism at local outlets around the country. And you are?
I'm Tom Rosenstiel, and I'm the executive director of the American Press Institute, which is about a 50-year-old organization that actually originally started at Columbia University.
I did not know that. I'm learning things already. So, I should mention that we're talking here through Blogging Head's Democracy in America program, and all parties here, by way of disclosure, are funded, I believe, by the Democracy Fund.
Yeah, we are funded by the Democracy Fund for one of our projects. Most of our funding comes from an endowment that has been collected over the years that is now fairly sizable.
Very nice. Yes, and somewhat. Well, we're not fortunate enough to have a sizable endowment, but likewise, my project is funded by the Marx Fund, not all of CJR. In any case, Tom, so we're going to talk about some some broader issues in journalism going on today a little bit later in the call, but I know your arrival at API, I think, has sort of coincided with a sort of change in what API is all about and what you're trying to do and accomplish and the nature of the institution. And I'm somewhat aware of what's happening there, but I'd be interested to hear more about it.
Sure. I arrived in January of 2013, so it's been about 18 months. API was, for its first 50 years, really, a brick-and-mortar training institute. It started in 1947, and really much of its activity was around training newspaper executives from either business or editorial when they were promoted to a new job or they were facing some new issues. There was a building in Reston, Virginia that was built in the 1970s, and it operated basically largely by fees, people, and particularly newspapers, paying people to come and be trained, usually peer-to-peer training. As news organizations became more strapped for funds with the disruption of the economic model, that brick-and-mortar training institute model began to falter with it. So we have come, and the staff I've built in the last 18 months have transformed the API from a brick-and-mortar training institute into a think tank. We focus on research, identifying where there's promising experimentation in revenue, trying to understand how the audience for news is changing, how they're behaving, how those changes are happening across different screens and technologies, and how to use digital tools to create better journalism. So those three areas. How is the audience behaving? Where are the promising revenue experiments? And how do you use the technology to create better, more valuable journalism? Those three things are intertwined. You have to understand the audience to create revenue models, and you have to use the tools to create journalism that matters to people. We spend a lot of money on research, audience research. We convene thought leaders who are at the outer edges of experimentation. And then we disseminate what we're learning as widely and through as many means as we can. And we've sold the building. We don't have that brick and mortar building anymore as our primary outreach.
Gotcha. So what is the theory of how a think? Obviously, this is a moment of. It's a cliche to say it's a moment of sort of like great disruption in the news industry. Et cetera. So is that essentially, what is the theory of how a think tank type institution can sort of what is the value add as opposed to the practice, in working newsrooms, at educational institutions, because I don't know that. I mean, do you guys see yourself as a competitor? Are there as a competitor to anybody else? Are there other think tanks in the news industry, or are you sort of pioneers in this way?
Well, I started the Project for Excellence in Journalism,
Right.
which was the
Right.
media research arm that later became part of the Pew Research Center. But we stopped our activities at the at our own door. We would produce research and hand it out, and we weren't involved in the last sort of 6 or 7 years of PEJ in solutions. It was about diagnosis, and that's really, I thought, not what the industry needs. We know what the diagnosis is, the collapse of the business model, and the arrival of new technology. The problem that needs to be addressed is, what are the solutions? We couldn't do that at Pew, and there really isn't actually a skunk works for the news media industry. It was an industry that, to a large degree, was knew its model and didn't spend a lot of money on R&D. There were some things in a few universities, not much, honestly, and there's a challenge for university work to be applied. The rewards for faculty and scholarship are different than the rewards for industry. It's not an applied arm of academia in the same way that business schools tend to be, or medical schools. And there are people who are pushing against that. Jay Rosen talks a lot about that. Eric Newton and the Knight Foundation have pushed for what they call the teaching hospital model. But there aren't really a lot of think tanks that are applied. So, we try and ask questions that people don't know the answers to, get those answers, and then get them into publishing suites, into newsrooms, into the hands of what we call decision makers and dreamers, who are the people who can make a difference and the people who are imagining a difference in the news business.
Gotcha. So, and what do you? I'm interested in I guess in big picture, like what you see as the attitude toward adoption of new practices. If you take revenue for example, like how much progress do you think that you have made, or with sort of outside thinkers that you've convened towards developing a sort of more robust alternative revenue model? And when you make progress either in that area or somewhere else, is there a big picture way that you can talk about sort of attitudes towards adoption of new practices in the industry when you try and go back and make that connection for practice and application?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a fair amount of activity of people spotlighting things that look promising. Neiman Labs does a wonderful job of sort of capturing new things that people write, new ideas. It's hard to track how do you put these things into practice in a way that makes a meaningful difference over time. That takes a long view, deep dives, and then with an eye towards real practicality. And since there aren't proven models, since things are moving quickly, it's easy to do the quick spotlighting. It's harder to do the more definitive, okay, what do we know over the course of 2 or 3 years about an area? So let's put that in concrete terms. A lot of activity about events. People are doing events, and they're making money at it, and everybody ought to do that. Okay, well, how do you do that? How do you get started? What are the do's and don'ts? What are the best practices? What are the pitfalls? If you were really serious about trying to get into this, and you're not in it, you're not the Texas Tribune, you're not Atlantic, media. What do you need to know so that you can adopt some of the things that pioneers are doing? Sponsored content, a lot of activity. Everybody wants to know about BuzzFeed. That's an interesting model. It's predicated on the idea that banner ads and pop-up ads are not the answer in a digital landscape to effective advertising that people enjoy. How can we invent new models, and how can we do it in a way that is ethical and well, that's a moving target, and there's a lot of uncertainty there. Let's bring everybody together and write something that. So we wrote a white paper that was about 40 pages that looked at how do you go about doing this? What is the state of knowledge of this? Our goal is to produce things that have enough depth that they are the definitive piece on something for 6 months or a year. In a rapidly moving landscape, that's a fair amount of time frame, as opposed to here's another interesting piece to see in your morning news feed that will add to your thinking, but it isn't really going to tell you how to put this into practice if you're in a small, fairly traditional legacy news organization, or you're a new startup with limited staff and limited skills. So how do you coalesce a bunch of ideas in a way that they can be widely used, and that's sort of the sweet spot. So we have the ability, we have access to cutting-edge thinkers, and our goal is to then translate that for a much wider audience than might be able to get to a session in New York or in Silicon Valley.
Tom, are you still there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
You dropped out for a second, but I got you again.
Okay.
Cool. Right. That all makes sense. So you mentioned the sort of like ethical considerations that come with some of these sort of new models that people are trying. In sponsored content in particular, I mean, I think, there are definitely, people, Andrew Sullivan has been very vocal as a critic of sponsored content. I think the consensus in the industry, and it's one that, that certainly writers here at CJR have embraced, is that, sponsored content done right is fine. You do need to be part of the appeal, right? Is this is an ad that doesn't look like an ad or doesn't act like a traditional ad, and you don't want to be sort of deceiving readers. And so you do need to you need to be sort of make clear that this is an ad. And if you make clear that it's an ad, is it effective? Will advertisers continue to pay for it? We'll see. But anyway, I guess the point of what I'm saying is I think there's a general consensus that sponsored content, done right and with some care is something that most of the industry is ethically comfortable with. We've written about a couple other models. So we have a writer, Corey Hutchins, who's written about a couple other sort of unusual arrangements for us. And in one case, he wrote about a couple smaller papers that took money from City Hall in the communities that they served. In one case, sort of a government-subsidized, very low-interest loan. In another case, a direct subsidy, essentially 5 figures cash, because small paper, small community, but still a meaningful sum plus the community sort of shuttered its newsletter to force advertisers to advertise in the print paper. In another case that we recently wrote about, a nonprofit umbrella arts organization essentially committed $15,000 to the daily paper in Greensboro to underwrite freelance coverage of the arts. They wanted essentially more coverage of what they do and the sort of the performing groups that they supported, and they paid to provide editorially independent coverage, but paid for by this umbrella arts organization. We've been a little surprised in both cases, and we took we took somewhat different stances in our own judgment about those cases. We've been a little surprised at the sort of the number of people who have, especially in sort of like the new media thinker world, who have fairly with little reservation embraced these arrangements, and essentially this coverage is important. It's not going to happen in other ways. We should take the money where it can be found. I mean, I don't want to sort of, maybe the position is more nuanced than that. But anyway, we've been, I guess, surprised by the number of people who just are fans of these sorts of deals. And I'd be curious, either about those particular cases or just more generally, what you're thinking of, what your attitude is about non-advertiser, sort of support for journalism at sort of for-profit commercial publications, including from the entities that may be covered.
Yeah. Well, you have sort of conflicting forces here that are useful to understand. One is, obviously, the basic advertising model has collapsed, which was based on scarcity. A handful of publications that could serve as intermediaries between advertisers, people selling goods and services, and the public. Because there were a limited number, they could charge a lot for the advertising, and that model has collapsed. The internet presents more and more advertising platforms every day, so the audience online is growing and going up, but the CPMs, the price you can charge for space online is going down. So you need alternative models. The second problem is that the first iteration of advertising online, which was to take display advertising and shrink it into banner ads and pop-up ads, has proven one that consumers resist. They don't like these ads generally. That's part of why you can't charge much for them, but the click-through rates are not great. So there is a desire to look for alternative revenue models. One form is, and I think the term native advertising is probably more useful than sponsored content, because it gets at what you're trying to do here, which is to create advertising that is native to the device and the platform and the context in which consumers are encountering it. So an ad on Twitter is designed to fit that format. An ad on a mobile device is a little different than an ad on a desktop. And BuzzFeed has made, caught people's attention because they want to create and use their skills to create advertising that people like, that people want to share, that can go viral. I don't think it's about deception, or it shouldn't be about deception as much as it should be about engagement for this advertising to be effective. Newspapers, magazines, television folks all had people who worked on making the advertising that they sold to advertisers engaging.
Right, absolutely.
And we give awards away for TV ads that people like. They have specials on the night before the Super Bowl with the Super Bowl ads as a show all by itself. So there's nothing wrong inherently, ethically, with creating advertising that people like.
Right.
What's wrong is if you engage in deception. And not is it wrong, but more importantly to the future of news, you end up destroying your franchise. If you become complicit in deceiving your audience, you destroy ultimately the franchise asset that that is your business, which is the trust, the covenant that you're an honest broker with your audience. So these are the ethical lines that are important to understand as people navigate. Now, another vector coming into this is that the people who are sort of utopians and optimistic about the impact of technology, they think there is going to be an economic model. They have a vested interest in that because they are advocates of the technology, and they've come to the point of recognizing that not everyone is going to actually be a journalist. There is a place for some professionalism, and there needs to be a way to finance that. So they're eager to find what those might be, and are receptive to experiments. and you need to have an open mind and yet also have a sense of moral code. And where that line is, it is what we're all trying to explore. So there are going to be, when you have economic pressure, there are going to be violations. There are going to be mistakes. There are going to be experiments that are well-intended that don't work, and there are going to be experiments that are cynical and are designed about deception, and you need enlightened donors who are going to protect their franchise. The old ways of doing that are not going to be sufficient, and that's the predicament we've been in for the last decade. But it is a change to recognize that there is a place for professionals, and there are plenty of people who are part of what some people call the future of news crowd, who thought essentially we didn't really need professional journalists, that we could, the crowd would create a kind of natural, organic, populist journalism. And I think we recognize now that this isn't a matter of one being replaced by the other. It's now what I call an organized intelligence that involves the community of consumers and the public in combination with the power of technology and the network, and the skills and access that professional journalists have to triangulate all the things that come in, do vetting and verification, and also have access to so that they can interrogate people in power.
Gotcha. So, all right. So your mention of sort of the professional, sort of the tests of professional journalism, vetting, verification, etc., sort of brings up something else that I'm curious to ask you about. The fact-checking movement in journalism, I think, is pretty well established. It's a global movement by this point. It gets sort of greater attention and energy goes to sort of fact-checking every campaign season, and where we're coming up on a midterm later, this fall, campaign getting underway. At CJR, we've definitely been sort of we've sort of supported the rise of this movement. We've also, especially through a writer named Brenda Nyan, who's now at contributing to the New York Times, sort of highlighted the limitations of the apparently limited ability of corrective information to sort of change people's beliefs about an issue, about not their values, but just about the facts of an issue, and sort of been a place for discussion about the both effective strategies in fact checking and sort of what it's realistic and what we can hope fact checking to accomplish. And I know API is currently involved in a research project about sort of attempting to find more effective, or to continue to identify effective strategies in fact checking. Is that a fair summary, or do you want to correct me? And I'd be interested to hear a little bit about what you're studying and any findings that you may be able to discuss.
The API activity, I'll make 2 points. One sort of about the history of fact-checking, where we are on this, and then another about sort of API's activities. So we have a grant, 2-year grant from the Democracy Fund, which also, as you said, funds some of the activities of CJR, to do 2 things. The first is to coordinate research from 7 university research scholars who've done work in fact-checking, to identify what kinds of fact-checking approaches are most effective. And what is meant by effective, it can be complex, because one kind of fact check might actually silence a politician from repeating a misrepresentative statement. A different kind of fact check potentially might persuade a voter who's inclined to like a politician that something that politician said is untrue. In other words, a sort of PolitiFact kind of fun thing that is going to get picked up a lot might, because it will get picked up and repeated, cause a politician to say, "Oh, I'm not going to say that again." But that whimsical approach might also be one that a supportive voter, potentially supportive voter, would reject because it's too whimsical and and they think it's not serious. Whereas a more dry, factual approach, potentially, which a politician might say, "Well, I can deflect that," might be a style of presentation that would be more likely to change someone's mind. We don't know the answer to that, but those are a couple of the research questions that I think are open. What kind of material is most likely to go viral if it's a fact check? What kind of material is most likely to get noticed by other reporters and be repeated, so that if somebody says something that's been proven to be wrong, how do you create a kind of collective memory about that in the press, so that you don't have to get it fact checked repeatedly?
Right.
These are all interesting questions. So there's been research done in previous cycles, and we're adding to that research. That's work that's being done by key scholars in the field, and we are collecting that, coordinating that, adding some research of our own to that, and that's going to occur over the first year of the grant, and including some retrospective work on the past cycles and some new work that will occur in this midterm. In the second year of the grant, in 2015, leading up to the eve of the next presidential election, we will be distilling that new research into best practices that we can teach to journalists and anybody else who's interested in trying to do fact-checking. There's more fact-checking of national elections activities, of course, but ironically, the more coverage there is of any given race, the less important any one piece of journalism is.
Right.
This is a truism about political journalism in general, that the importance of any one actor or journalist in a presidential race is smaller. Whereas if you're the lone journalist covering a House race, what you say has a lot of impact.
Right.
So one of the tasks here is to spread fact-checking into new kinds of races that are not being monitored now, and also to get journalists to recognize how can they make fact-checking, or the vetting of political rhetoric and the elevation of the accuracy of our political discourse, into something that occurs not just in races, not just in campaigns, but as part of our coverage of governance. So that's one point, and that's essentially what we've been asked by the Democracy Fund to do. And our combination of sort of having a lot of experience doing training and our background with the staff we have at API now of doing research ourselves, being able to understand academic research, having a lot of experience with scholars as colleagues, that's sort of why I think we are a good fit here for this. The second point that's interesting to make is what we think of, I think, as the fact-checking movement has more history than people realize. Really goes back to about 1990. And the reason this history is important is it may tell us what we're about to encounter in the next couple of cycles. The fact-checking movement really started as the ad squad movement when journalists began to, in the early 90s, say, wow, the advertising that voters see may be more important than the rhetoric the politicians offer from the stump. And we need to somehow get our hands on these ads and vet them for accuracy. Back then, politicians didn't make ads available to journalists, and they didn't offer a lot of verification or justification of the statements that were in those ads. This early movement took root in the Senate campaigns of 1990, and then in the presidential races of 92 and 96. You had it seeped into a significant amount of coverage. CBS had a thing called Fact Check, or Reality Check, that was a regular feature every week on the CBS Evening News. CNN had a full-time fact-checking reporter, Brooks Jackson, who now runs factcheck.org at the Annenberg School. That's all he did for CNN. He was on all the time, and the movement sort of rose and then began to peter out as politicians figured out ways to contend with this. Mm-hmm. The new resurgence of what we call fact-checking probably can date back to the creation of PolitiFact, which was, I'm going to forget now whether it was 2004, 2008, but has led to this other movement. But we began to see pushback in 2012, where politicians were beginning to attack the fact-checkers for faulty methodology. PolitiFact in Virginia was one such target. So we're at a point now where we need to see whether we're at sort of 1998, 2000, where fact-checking could subside again because of pushback and people begin to question its effectiveness inside newsrooms, or whether we're in another phase where we're going to continue to see more fact-checking. And I think the critical element here is that journalists are smart about how they do it and learn to do it in a way that is grounded in empirical data about what works and what doesn't.
Right. And, in addition to politicians attacking, I mean, there's also, some fairly high-profile partisan media figures, whether you want to describe as partisan or sort of, liberal or conservative media figures who have attacked fact checkers. A whole host of sort of conservative writers have gone after, and PolitiFact I think is the most common target here. There's certainly, Glenn Kessler and Fact Check have come in for some attacks as well. A whole host of conservative writers. Rachel Maddow at MSNBC, the most prominent liberal writer, and there's sometimes the line blurs a little bit between whether it's a critique of a sort of a particular judgment or a particular sort of approach or technique, or whether it's a critique of sort of the entire premise of the operation.
Right, and again, we've seen this sort of arc before, and I think one of the things that is important is that fact-checking should not be a partisan activity. I mean, I dare say after 40 years of being in journalism myself, it's one party doesn't have any greater claim on rectitude about the truth than another. There are liars on both sides, on all sides, and it's incumbent on the fact checkers.
There's a very heated debate about right. Well, which we probably don't need to get into now about whether to what extent that sort of equivalence. To what extent that characterization precisely captures, the sort of current state of American politics.
Anybody who thinks that. Okay, well, I'll just stipulate to the idea that one party isn't more accurate than the other. It's just not the case.
Anyway, as
I've been at it a long time.
Right. So I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sidetrack.
And it's incumbent on fact checkers to have some system, some methodology mm-hmm. that is defensible in the same way that any social scientist would have to do the same thing. You have to, and I'm not sure that everybody has approached it from that point of view. When we move to journalism in a system where everyone can be a press critic and everybody can examine how you do your work, you have to have a better methodology. You have to write about your methods. You have to be more transparent about your work product and your work process. And that's one of the good things about the age we're in is it will make you have a better work process. You better have one because you are going to be examined.
It's true. Tom, we've covered a lot of ground. Anything else that we should talk about before we say goodbye?
Only this. We're in a period of enormous uncertainty in journalism because We've gone from the lecture to the dialogue. We've gone from journalists being powerful intermediaries who were listened to and had the ability to force feed their audience, to an era in which journalists are another voice, an important one, but only one voice. And that is going to make journalism better. How that's going to be financed, I think, is not clear. But in an era when information is in oversupply or in great supply, accurate knowledge actually becomes harder to create because people have to sift through more facts, through more dissonant facts and conflicting facts, and through more falsehood to know what they can believe and what they can trust. That is an enormous opportunity and challenge for those who aspire to produce news, but it is in the end, their savior, their calling, we simply need to figure out a new way that we do that.
All right. Well, good luck continuing to help us all figure out a way that we do that. Okay. It's good talking to you, Tom.
You too. Great.
Right.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.